The Vietnam War, a veteran's legacy. Throughout American wars, returning soldiers were greeted back into civilian life with open arms and often treated as heroes for their sacrifices for their country. In the words of Eric Dean, soldiers may have developed psychological problems due to the exposure to combat during the war, but that these problems were washed away by the ritual of acceptance and celebration by appreciative citizens. However, veterans from the Vietnam War came back home to a society that rejected them, and more often than not, treated them as misfits. It was not uncommon for a soldier to come back and have a number of readjustment problems, including high unemployment, drug addiction, divorce, suicide, crime, ill health due to the exposure of Agent Orange, and lingering psychological problems that manifested themselves in the form of flashbacks, nightmares, depression, guilt over atrocities, and dead buddies who did not come back. A Vietnam soldier participated in their fair share of battle and did everything necessary to protect themselves and their country, so why were they unaccepted when introduced back into society? The Vietnam War can be deemed an auxiliary war that complemented the Cold War. The war was fought between the USA and the Viet Cong of North Vietnam from 1965 to 1973 for US troops. The North was attempting to invade southern Vietnam to create a larger, more powerful Vietnam. The factor that made the US get involved was that the Viet Cong were looking to create a communist form of government, which would help tip the scales in the power struggle between communist Russia and democratic US. Over 58,000 American troops were killed, and over 3 million in total lost their lives. Due to lack of public support, Americans eventually withdrew from Vietnam, and the Viet Cong easily took control. As a result, Vietnam became unified under the direct control of Ho Chi Minh. Ho Chi Minh was supported by China and other communist powers during the war, so he implemented communist regimes in his version of a totalitarian government. During this time, the American public began losing interest in Vietnam at an alarming rate. Suddenly, Lyndon Johnson's excuse of containment of communism wasn't good enough anymore. There are many causes of the lack of public support, which much of it coming from the fact that the public was promised a quick altercation, but was surprised with rising commitment and death totals for Americans. Many also began to sympathize with the Vietnamese, who were now being portrayed as a country fighting to keep out foreign influence. As a result of their growing impatience, protests to the war were quickly becoming more popular, with many of them occurring on college campuses. While these protests were usually peaceful, some did erupt into violence, and there were some casualties. A famous example of this happened at Kent State University in 1970. This tragedy made the cover of Life magazine and further portrayed the government as ruthless and uninterested in the concerns of the public. With the general population already unsatisfied with the war effort, the government tried to fudge the truth several times in order to keep the support up and prevent it from decreasing any further. However, this just dug them into a larger hole and really got the public mistrustful of the government. One famous example of this is when the Viet Cong had taken over the south capital of Saigon. Initial reports had it described as a bloodbath, and made it seem like the Viet Cong were ruthless and barbaric towards the south. Claudia Creek, who was an eyewitness to the event, stated that they all spoke the same language, of course. In fact, many families that had been split between the north and the south met again in those first few days, after decades apart. Soldiers met each other, took pictures, and shared stories. Vietnam veterans did not help themselves either. The public already had a low approval rate for the war, and once rumors of the behavior of soldiers got out, approval really plummeted. War is a terrible event, and soldiers in each generation had their own unique method to cope. In Vietnam, many options to relieve stress were available, and this led to some poor decision-making by soldiers in service. One of these coping methods was drug use. In 1971, a study was conducted by Dr. Lee Robin on the validity of rumors coming out of Vietnam that drug use had spread amongst the soldiers. What she found was mind-boggling. She found that almost half, 45%, had used either opium or heroin at least once during their tour of duty. 11% had tested positive for opiates on the way out of Vietnam. Overall, about 20% reported that they had been addicted to heroin at some point during their term of service overseas. When this reached the public, there was much backlash, and stereotypes of the Vietnam soldier became ever more standard. During war, it is not uncommon for soldiers to occasionally get out of hand and be exceptionally brutal towards soldiers from the opposing side, or sometimes even civilians. While Americans believed that it would only happen to the troops they were fighting, they were brought to a horrifying conclusion that American troops also participate in these atrocities. This became apparent when word of the My Lai massacre reached the States. Army commanders had advised the soldiers of Charlie Company that all who were found in Sun Mai could be considered VC or active Viet Cong sympathizers and ordered them to destroy the village. When they arrived, the soldiers found no Viet Cong, who rounded up and murdered hundreds of civilians, mostly women, children, and old men, in an extremely brutal fashion, including rape and torture. The fact that American troops would commit such awful crimes devastated the American public. Suddenly, the American troops were no longer the good guys, and this had a direct relation to the citizens of America wanting to end the war with Vietnam. Experiencing the true nature of war is one of the worst things that can happen to a person. As a result of the shock that a person would go through, each person would usually develop a coping method. Vietnam was a great example of how quickly drugs could be that easy-to-find coping method. Others would include taking out their anger on civilians and participating in other events that would be illegal back in the United States. However, this did not shield them from the horrors of war, and many would come back scarred from their time in service. A serious ethical and morally challenging question is, if the soldiers in other parts of the world commit outrageous crimes, should they be pardoned for their sacrifices or be shunned completely? One must take into account that no one except soldiers have truly experienced war. So, can we judge them based on their common right or wrong scale? Based on how veterans were treated when returning, it seemed the general public thought that was the case, and therefore treated the veterans of Vietnam as a sort of criminal.